The room erupted in laughter the instant my daughter-in-law let my hand-knitted baby blanket fall into the trash. She smiled toward her friend's phone as if she'd just delivered the perfect joke. "We only use designer things for our baby," she announced, proud of herself. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply walked to the garbage can, lifted the blanket out with both hands, folded it carefully, slipped it into my bag, and quietly walked away. That evening my phone rang. My son's voice was shaking so badly I almost didn't recognize it. "Mom," he whispered. "Please tell me you took the blanket home. Tell me, what was hidden inside it?" I looked down at the folded blanket resting on my lap, placed my trembling hand across the fabric, and thought of my husband. Only then did I answer. "Why are you asking now, Kyle?" "My name is Darlene Mercer. I'm 68 years old, and for 4 decades I owned a small tailoring shop on Bell Street. Wedding gowns, school uniforms, business suits, funeral clothes, I stitched, repaired, and altered thousands of pieces over the years. Most people looked at fabric and saw cloth. I looked at it and saw stories. One loose stitch could tell me whether someone rushed a job. A carefully repaired seam could reveal how deeply a person treasured what they owned. Expensive labels never impressed me much. I've watched costly coats fall apart after one winter while ordinary sweaters, lovingly repaired, stayed in families for generations. That's something life teaches you if you're patient enough to listen. These days my fingers don't cooperate the way they once did. Arthritis arrived quietly a few years ago and settled into my hands like an unwanted tenant. Some mornings I have to soak them in warm water before they can even curl around a knitting needle. Every movement hurts a little. Still. For 4 months I knitted that blanket. Every row demanded something from me. Every stitch carried a memory. Not because anyone asked me to. Because someone I loved had. That someone was my husband, Frank. Frank and I shared 43 wonderful years together before a tired Tuesday morning changed everything. Hospitals have a strange way of making time feel both painfully slow and unbearably fast. One moment you're discussing dinner plans, and the next you're learning how silent a house can become after one heartbeat disappears. Frank wasn't the kind of man who tried to impress people. He drove the same old pickup until it practically begged for retirement. He wore jackets long after fashion forgot them. If someone needed help, he'd quietly offer it without expecting anyone to notice. His greatest talent wasn't making money. It was thinking ahead. While other people chased bigger houses or newer cars, Frank believed in building tomorrow one careful step at a time. He used to tell me, "Patience grows things excitement never can." Back then I smiled whenever he said it. I didn't realize how literally he meant those words. Long before anyone even mentioned grandchildren, Frank already dreamed about them. He imagined teaching a little one to bait a fishing hook. He planned imaginary camping trips. He even practiced terrible grandpa jokes on me just to see if they'd earn a laugh someday. Our only son, Kyle, married later than expected. Then months became years before there was finally news of a baby. Frank was happier than I'd seen him in decades. But life doesn't always wait for our happiest moments. 10 months before that baby shower, Frank slipped away before he could ever hold the grandchild he'd spent years dreaming about. A week before he passed, he asked me to reach into the top shelf of our bedroom closet. "Bring me the old cigar box," he said. I'd seen that dusty wooden box sitting there for nearly 30 years. Never once had I opened it. I assumed it held old receipts or keepsakes from his father. I couldn't have been more wrong. Inside were neat bundles of United States savings bonds, carefully organized by year with aging rubber bands wrapped around each stack. There were dozens of them. An envelope rested on top. Across the front, written in Frank's unmistakable block handwriting, were 7 simple words. "For our first grandchild." My heart stopped. Frank smiled weakly from his hospital bed as I stared at the box, completely speechless. "I started buying them when Kyle was 10, he whispered. I slowly looked back at him, unable to form a single sentence. And that was only the beginning of a secret that would change everything. Frank watched me holding that old cigar box, and despite the exhaustion written across his face, there was a quiet pride in his eyes. I figured someday, he said softly, pausing to catch his breath, there'd be a little one running around who'd need a head start in life. I carefully lifted one bundle after another from the box. Every stack had a year written on it in Frank's handwriting. Every birthday. Every Christmas bonus. Every extra dollar he could spare without anyone noticing. For nearly 30 years, he'd been building a future for a child he wasn't even sure he'd live to meet. Tears blurred my vision. "Frank," I whispered. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" He smiled the way only he could. "Because saving isn't about applause. It's about showing up when the moment finally arrives." I asked him how much they were worth. He hesitated for only a second before answering. "Just under 50,000. I stared at him in disbelief. Not because of the amount. Because I knew exactly what it had cost him. Frank had skipped vacations. He repaired things instead of replacing them. He wore worn-out boots until the soles nearly separated. Every sacrifice suddenly made sense. He hadn't been denying himself. He'd been quietly saying yes to someone else's future. Then he reached for my hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes were steady. "Promise me something." "I promise." "Don't hand them an envelope." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "If they get a plain envelope full of money, they'll spend it and eventually forget where it came from." His breathing grew slower. "I want our grandchild to remember." I leaned closer so I wouldn't miss a single word. "Hide it somewhere they'll treasure." He smiled. "Sew it into something made with love." His voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. "Make them discover it." Those were among the last clear instructions my husband ever gave me. After he was gone, the house became painfully quiet. The tick-ing clock sounded louder. His empty chair seemed impossible not to notice. For weeks I wandered from room to room pretending to stay busy, but grief always found me. Then one morning I opened my yarn cabinet. Cream-colored wool caught my eye. Soft. Warm. Strong. Exactly the kind Frank would have chosen. I bought several more skeins and began knitting. Every stitch became a conversation with him. Some days I smiled remembering his awful jokes. Other days tears landed on the yarn before I realized I was crying. My arthritis fought me constantly. There were evenings I could barely straighten my fingers afterward. Still, I never skipped a day. Because this wasn't simply a blanket. It was Frank's final promise stitched into wool. When I finished the last row 4 months later, I spread it across my dining table. It was beautiful. A soft cream blanket surrounded by tiny blue sailboats along the border. Frank loved fishing more than anywhere else on earth, so the sailboats felt right. In one tiny corner I knitted his initials. FM. Small enough that most people would never notice. Exactly how Frank would have wanted it. But the blanket still wasn't complete. My years as a seamstress had taught me tricks most people never imagine. Travelers used to ask me to sew hidden pockets inside jackets before overseas trips. Invisible compartments. Safe enough that even experienced pickpockets couldn't find them. That afternoon I turned the blanket over and carefully stitched a flat pocket beneath the lining. Unless someone knew exactly where to feel, it couldn't be seen. Into that hidden space I placed every savings bond. Then I picked up another envelope. This one mattered even more. It contained a letter. Frank had dictated every word from his hospital bed while I wrote through tears. The letter wasn't for me. It wasn't even for Kyle. It was addressed to the grandchild he'd never get to meet. Across the front I carefully wrote. To be opened. On your 18th birthday. Inside were his hopes. His life lessons. Stories about our family. Advice about kindness, honesty, patience, and courage. It wasn't a letter. It was a grandfather introducing himself across time. I sealed the envelope, slipped it beside the bonds, then stitched the pocket closed so neatly even I struggled to find the seam afterward. When I finished, I rested both hands on the blanket. Inside that soft wool rested nearly $50,000. And the final words of the man I'd loved for 43 years. I wrapped the blanket in plain cream paper with a simple blue ribbon. Nothing fancy. Frank would have laughed at expensive wrapping paper. The gift itself was what mattered. As the baby shower approached, I imagined the moment over and over. Madison would unwrap the blanket. I'd smile and gently say, "There's something special hidden inside." Everyone would gather around as she found the secret pocket. Kyle would recognize his father's handwriting. There would be tears. Laughter. Stories about Frank. Our grandchild would begin life knowing how deeply they had been loved before they were ever born. That picture played in my mind every single day. I never imagined reality would look anything like what actually happened. Because while I was dreaming about honoring Frank's memory, someone else was already planning a party where appearances mattered more than love. And I had no idea that my husband's greatest gift was about to be judged by nothing more than its lack of a designer label. The invitation arrived on thick ivory cardstock with gold trim. Madison's garden baby celebration. There was even a dress code. I smiled when I read it. At 68, I'd been to enough baby showers to know they were usually about laughter, sandwiches, and opening tiny gifts. This one looked more like the launch of a luxury brand. Still, none of that bothered me. All I cared about was the blanket waiting on my dresser. I bought myself a new navy blouse with a delicate lace collar. Nothing extravagant, just something nice enough for an important family day. Before leaving the house, I wrapped Frank's blanket in fresh cream paper and tied the same blue ribbon around it one last time. As I carried the package to my car, I caught myself talking out loud. "Well, Frank," I smiled, placing it carefully on the passenger seat where he always used to sit. "Today's the day." For a moment, it almost felt like he was riding beside me again. The drive was peaceful. I imagined our future grandson wrapped in that blanket someday, completely unaware of the incredible story hidden inside it. That thought alone made every mile feel lighter. The moment I pulled into Gail's driveway, I realized this wasn't going to be an ordinary baby shower. Luxury cars lined both sides of the street. Fresh white flowers framed the entrance. A massive balloon display surrounded the front porch, and elegant music drifted through hidden speakers in the garden. It looked less like a family gathering and more like a magazine photo shoot. Inside, everything matched. The decorations. The furniture. Even the guests. Nearly everyone looked polished enough to appear on television. I suddenly became very aware of my sensible shoes and simple handbag. But then I looked down at the box in my hands and smiled. They had expensive gifts. I had something priceless. That was enough. Madison greeted guests with flawless makeup and a practiced smile. Pregnancy suited her, but then now she seemed more focused on the camera following her than on the people arriving. Her friend Brooke filmed nearly everything. Every hug. Every compliment. Every gift placed on the table. "This will look amazing online," Brooke kept saying. Nearby, Gail floated through the room introducing guests while somehow managing to mention the brand name of almost every decoration. The flowers came from New York. The cake was specially designed. The baby furniture is imported. It was exhausting. Kyle spotted me from across the room. His face softened instantly. He walked over and kissed my cheek. "I'm glad you came, Mom." "So am I." He glanced toward Madison before lowering his voice. "Sorry if today gets complicated." I studied his face. There was something behind his smile. Something tired. Something resigned. Before I could ask what he meant, someone called his name, and he hurried away. I watched him disappear into the crowd. Frank used to say Kyle had inherited his gentle heart. Unfortunately, he'd also inherited the habit of avoiding conflict whenever possible. I found a quiet chair near the edge of the room. Within minutes, someone sat beside me. Frank's younger sister, Caroline. She squeezed my hand warmly. You brought it? I nodded toward the wrapped box resting beside my chair. It's finally finished. I knew you'd make something beautiful. Her eyes filled for a second. Frank would have been so proud. So would I admitted softly. She leaned closer. Does Madison know what's inside? I smiled. Not yet. You really aren't going to tell her first? I shook my head. Frank wanted them to discover it. Caroline laughed gently. That sounds exactly like my stubborn brother. For the first time that afternoon, I truly relaxed. Talking about Frank always made him feel close again. Eventually everyone gathered around the decorated gift table. Madison settled into an oversized white chair. That looked more like a throne than party furniture. Brooke stood directly in front of her with the camera already recording. Ready? Brooke asked. Madison flashed a perfect smile. Always. One by one, the gifts were opened. Every package became its own little performance. A luxury stroller. So beautiful. Oh, this brand is impossible to get. Guests applauded. Photos were taken. Labels were proudly announced. Expensive diaper bags. Designer baby clothes. Imported blankets. Customized furniture accessories. Each gift received admiration based almost entirely on the name attached to it. I quietly watched my plain cream package sitting near the end of the table. Compared to everything else, it looked painfully ordinary. Yet inside lay 30 years of patience. 30 years of sacrifice. 30 years of a grandfather loving a child he hadn't even met. No designer logo could compete with that. Only 2 presents remained. A greeting card with money. And mine. Gail picked up my package between 2 perfectly manicured fingers. She smiled politely. And this one is from Grandma Darlene. Several guests looked toward me. Someone whispered. She probably knitted something. A few people smiled politely. Another guest chuckled. Madison accepted the box and studied the plain wrapping for a brief moment. There was something about the expression on her face that tightened my stomach. She looked disappointed. Not curious. Not grateful. Simply disappointed before she'd even opened it. Still, I wasn't worried. As soon as she unfolded the blanket, I'd tell her about the hidden seam. Everything would make sense. Everything would change. I leaned forward in my chair as Madison untied the blue ribbon. The cream paper slipped away. The blanket unfolded across her lap. For one beautiful second, the entire room fell silent. And I honestly believed Frank's final wish was about to come true. Then Madison looked down the handmade stitches. Wrinkled her nose. And opened her mouth. Madison held the blanket up by its corners, letting the soft cream wool unfold for everyone to see. For a brief moment, I caught myself smiling. The tiny blue sailboats glowed beneath the afternoon light. Frank's initials rested quietly in the corner, almost invisible unless someone looked closely. Every painful stitch, every sleepless night, every memory woven into that blanket was finally on display. I waited for her smile. Instead, her expression hardened. She tilted her head as if inspecting something defective. Oh, she said, forcing a polite laugh. You actually made this yourself? I did, I answered warmly. There's something special about. Before I could finish, she spoke over me. That's thoughtful. The pause after the word told everyone exactly what she really meant. Gail laughed softly beside her. Well, she said with a sugary smile, homemade gifts certainly have sentimental value. Several guests gave awkward little laughs. My cheeks grew warm. Still, I stayed calm. I simply needed Madison to open the blanket a little farther. Just another few seconds. Just enough to tell her about the hidden pocket. I leaned forward again. Madison, sweetheart, if you unfold the bottom edge. But Brooke's camera was still pointed directly at her. And Madison wasn't thinking about my words. She was thinking about her audience. She glanced around the beautifully decorated room, at the mountain of luxury gifts beside her, then back at the blanket in her hands. I watched the decision form behind her eyes. It happened in an instant. A handmade blanket didn't fit the image she wanted people to remember. She stood, still smiling for the camera. There is one tiny problem, she joked. The room waited. She laughed again. Our nursery has a very specific style. Another ripple of laughter. Then she walked toward the tall trash can standing beside the gift table. For one unbelievable second, my mind refused to understand what I was seeing. Surely she was joking. Surely she would stop. Surely. She held my blanket over the opening. We only use designer things for our baby. And she let go. The blanket disappeared into the trash. The sound was barely louder than a whisper. But inside me, it landed like thunder. Around the room, nervous laughter spread again. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others smiled because everyone else was smiling. Brooke never lowered the camera. She captured every second. I looked across the room. Kyle had gone completely pale. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something. Anything. But no words came. His shoulders slumped. And then, he stayed silent. That silence hurt far more than the blanket falling into the garbage. He didn't know what was hidden inside. I understood that. But he knew who had made it. He knew his grieving mother had spent months knitting it with aching hands. And still, he chose peace over courage. In that moment, I realized my son hadn't lost his kindness. He had simply forgotten that kindness without courage often becomes another form of silence. I closed my eyes for one slow breath. I had two choices. I could shout. Tell everyone there were nearly $50,000 sewn inside. Reveal Frank's final letter. Embarrass Madison in front of every guest and every camera. Part of me wanted to. Every grieving widow inside my heart wanted to. But another voice, Frank's voice, rose quietly above my anger. Time pays interest on patience. I opened my eyes. Without saying a word, I stood. The room gradually became silent as everyone watched me walk toward the trash can. I reached inside carefully. Lifted the blanket out. A few scraps of wrapping paper clung to the wool. I brushed them away gently, almost the way I used to dust flour off Kyle's little jacket when he was a boy. Then I folded the blanket exactly as I had folded thousands of garments in my tailoring shop. Neat. Precise. Restful. No shaking hands. No angry tears. Only dignity. Madison forced another laugh. Oh, did you want to keep it? Of course. I just thought. It's all right, dear, I interrupted softly. It simply wasn't meant for someone who couldn't see its value. The words were quiet. Yet somehow they echoed through the room louder than shouting ever could. Madison's smile faltered. For the first time all afternoon, she looked uncertain. She hadn't expected calm. She had expected tears. People know how to defend themselves against anger. They rarely know what to do with quiet disappointment. I slipped the folded blanket into my handbag. Turned toward the guests. Thank you for inviting me, I said gently. I wish all of you, and especially the baby, a lifetime filled with love. Then I looked once at Kyle. Our eyes met. His were full of guilt. Mine held only sadness. I walked out of the house without another word. I managed to stay composed until I reached my car. The moment I closed the driver's door, everything inside me collapsed. I hugged the blanket against my chest and cried. Not because it had touched a trash can, but because my husband's last gift had been measured by a logo instead of by love. I whispered through my tears. I'm sorry, Frank. I should have protected it better. Then something unexpected happened. The tears stopped. A calm certainty settled over me. I looked down at the blanket resting safely in my lap. No, I whispered. Your gift will still reach our grandson. But not the way they expected. At that exact moment, my phone began to ring. It was Caroline. And what she told me next would change everything. Caroline's voice was trembling before I could even say hello. Darlene. I'm so sorry. It's all right, I replied quietly, though my heart still ached. No, it isn't. She took a shaky breath. After you left, I couldn't stay silent. I went straight to Kyle and told him what Frank had hidden inside the blanket. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. You told him? I thought he already knew. The moment I mentioned the savings bonds and Frank's letter. Darlene, he looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under him. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Caroline whispered, he left immediately. He didn't even say goodbye. After we ended the call, I drove home in silence. The house felt as empty as it had the day Frank passed away. I carried the blanket to my kitchen table, carefully opened the hidden seam, and checked everything inside. The bonds were untouched. The letter was exactly where I'd stitched it. I gently ran my hand over Frank's handwriting. I kept my promise, I whispered. Before I could sew the pocket closed again, the phone rang. Kyle. The instant I answered, I heard him crying. Mom. His voice cracked. Please tell me you brought the blanket home. I did. It's safe? Yes. A long, broken sigh escaped him before he burst into tears. Oh, thank God. After a few moments he asked the question that changed him forever. What was inside it? I closed my eyes. Your father spent nearly 30 years buying savings bonds for his first grandchild. Silence. They're worth almost $50,000. Another silence. And there was a letter. A letter? He dictated it from his hospital bed. It's for your son to open on his 18th birthday. Kyle didn't speak. Then I heard something I hadn't heard since he was a little boy. He sobbed. I stood there, he whispered. I watched her throw Dad's last gift into the trash, and I did nothing. You didn't know. But I knew you made it. His words broke my heart. I chose the easy path again. I let him cry. Sometimes love isn't finding the perfect words. Sometimes it's simply staying on the line. Finally he spoke again. What can I do? I looked at Frank's blanket lying across my table. We're going to finish what your father started. 2 weeks later, after baby Hudson was born, I invited the entire family to Sunday dinner. Kyle came carrying his newborn son. Madison arrived quietly. Even Gail accepted the invitation. Dinner passed politely, but everyone knew why they were really there. When the plates were cleared, I placed the blanket in the center of the table. This, I said gently, is the gift Frank wanted his grandson to receive. I picked up a small seam ripper and carefully opened the hidden pocket. One by one, I removed the contents. The thick stack of savings bonds. Then the sealed envelope. The room fell completely silent. Kyle stared at his father's handwriting. Madison's face drained of color. What is this?" she whispered. 30 years of your father-in-law's love," I answered. He bought these bonds a little at a time for the first grandchild he prayed he'd someday meet. I placed the letter beside them. And this is the last message he ever wrote. Madison covered her mouth. I didn't know. No, I said calmly. You never looked. Tears filled Kyle's eyes. Madison finally whispered the words I'd waited weeks to hear. I'm sorry. Whether they came from guilt or embarrassment, only God knows. but they were spoken. I nodded gently. I believe people deserve the chance to grow. Then I shared the decision I'd already made. The money now belongs to Hudson through an education trust. Kyle nodded immediately. I understand. It can't be touched by anyone until he's grown. Again he nodded. I would have done the same. I smiled proudly. For the first time in years. My son wasn't choosing the easy path. He was choosing the right one. Then I opened Frank's letter. Only the introduction. Just as he'd asked. I read his words aloud. If you're hearing this, then our little miracle has finally arrived. I may not be there to hold you, but I have loved you for decades already. Never judge people by what they own. Judge them by what they quietly give when nobody is watching. By the time I finished reading, tears filled every eye around the table. Even Gail looked down in silence. Frank had reached his family after all. Exactly as he'd hoped. Months passed. Hudson grew stronger. The education fund continued growing quietly, just as Frank would have wanted. Kyle changed more than anyone. He stopped staying silent simply to keep peace. He learned that protecting the people you love sometimes requires uncomfortable courage. One afternoon he came to my house alone. I've spent my whole life avoiding conflict, he admitted. But Dad never did. I smiled. No. He protected what mattered. Kyle nodded. So will I. As for Madison. One afternoon she surprised me. She arrived carrying knitting needles. Would you? She asked nervously. Teach me? I looked at her for a long moment. Then I smiled. Sit down. Her first stitches were uneven. Her little baby hat came out crooked. She laughed at herself. And for the first time since I'd known her. There wasn't a designer label anywhere in sight. Only effort. Only humility. Only love. Today, Frank's blanket rests across Hudson's crib. The little blue sailboats still surround him every night. The hidden pocket is empty now. Its treasure has already found its rightful place. But the blanket still carries something far more valuable than money. It carries a grandfather's patience. A grandmother's love. And a lesson our family will never forget. Because true worth has never been stitched onto a label. It's stitched into the hearts willing to love quietly. Long before anyone notices.